Hamatakapi. This is Nick Estes with the co-host of the Red Nation podcast, calling in live from Minneapolis, homeland of the Dakota people. We are joined by a special guest, somebody whose work I've followed over the years, Gord Hill. He's joining us to talk a little bit about his own work, but also this article that he's written for Warrior Publications. It should be posted in the chat if you want to check it out. It involves the assassination of Anne Mae Aquash and Leonard Peltier's recent commutation of his sentence under the former President Biden. But I just want to take this moment to welcome our guest, Gord Hill. Gord, if you want to maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your own work.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thanks for having me on your show. Yeah, I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, and our territories on northern Vancouver Island in so-called British Columbia. And I'm currently residing on the Numgeese Reservation in Alert Bay, also known as Yalis. I've been involved in Indigenous resistance movements since around 1990. Traveled a lot across Canada and the United States to different gatherings and events and actions and whatnot. And I do a lot of artwork. So I've always used my art for the movement and making logos and T-shirts and posters and stuff. And around 2010, I think, is when I had my first graphic novel. This one here. Mm, it's when I had my first graphic novel published, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, with Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. And I've published a few other graphic novels, an Antifa comic book, and then we did an anti-capitalist resistance comic book, and then did a revision of the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. And they did a full color version of the comic this time. And I expanded the chapters and whatnot, and I felt like my artwork had gotten a lot better. And there was a lot of gaps in the original black and white version of the comic that I wanted. I just felt I could just really wanted to do justice to the history of Indigenous resistance, and so that was the most recent graphic novel that I worked on.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to actually teach 500 years of Indigenous resistance in a course of mine. Students really, loved it. And in fact, I was in Toronto. There was a protest in solidarity with the postal workers, and people were handing out buttons for May Day, and it had your art on there too, and it was really cool because it was like a Palestinian kafia, and then obviously you're recognizable, like your style, was on there, and I was like, hey, is this from like Gord Hill? And they were like, yeah, it's from Gord Hill. He does all of our graphics for Mayday, so you're pretty well known. I mean, even inside and outside, Native communities, but also I would say on the left and in labor movements and things like that. So very much appreciated your work and your advocacy over the years. Um, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about your own personal experiences with land defense, in your territories and beyond, and how that influences your art and the art that you produce.
Sure. So yeah, around 1990, during the Oka crisis here in Canada, um, that's when I really I kind of oriented myself towards the Indigenous movements. Um, Before that, I was involved in the anarchist movement, and that's how I really got politicized, was through anarchist punk. Actually, I was actually in the military. I was in the Army Cadets and the Army Reserve, and a cousin of mine was really into punk, and I started listening to punk, and I started reflecting on the lyrics and what they were talking about, and then I would go down to my military training, and I just kind of had a transformation of my thinking and my consciousness, and so that was how I got radicalized. The first group I was involved with was a solidarity group with El Salvador, which at the time, this was in the mid to late 80s. El Salvador was involved in a civil war. There was a revolutionary movement fighting against like a fascist government supported by the United States. So that also kind of played a big part in my in my worldview, my analysis of society that we're living in. And after Oka 1990, when I really focused on Indigenous peoples, um, I did a lot of work on the 500-year centenary of the invasion of the Americas. Because in 1892, there are a lot of governments who are doing a lot of big celebrations and stuff like that. Um, I That's when I wrote and researched uh, the 500 years of resistance. Originally, I was publishing a newsletter at the time called Otoken, and I published it in that. That was later published by PM Press, I think, as a small book. Um, I went down to San Francisco in October in 1992 because they were having big resistance actions against these reenactments of Columbus's ships and stuff like that. Um, it was with the Native Youth Movement, which formed in Vancouver around 1995, 1996. And that was shortly after the Chipatan standoff here in central British Columbia, which was also known as Gustafson Lake. And that was it was like a Sundance camp that was being attacked by this racist American rancher, and it eventually became this big armed standoff with like 450 heavily armed police being deployed with military vehicles and whatnot. And so I did a lot of solidarity organizing in Vancouver around that. Um, and it was around that time the Native Youth Movement formed. And so I started working with the Native Youth Movement. I think one of the biggest actions we did was there was a small reserve just outside of Vancouver. It's called Chiam, and they're along the Fraser River. And so they've been involved in fisheries disputes with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for quite a few years. So we went out there and we spent an entire summer out there, and we acted like as a security force, and we accompanied the fishermen as they went out to prevent the DFO from coming in and raiding their camps and taking their boats and taking their fish and whatnot. So that was a pretty successful campaign because we prevented the DFO from seizing any fish or any of the fishing gear or anything throughout the entire summer. Um, and then I was involved in the Wet'suwet'en campaign against the pipelines. So we organized a lot of solidarity rallies, and we went up to Unistaten camp, um, and just kind of helped facilitate some of their organizing and whatnot. Um, I participated in different blockades with the Shikwepmik, uh, who a lot of these were the families that were involved in the Chipatan standoff. And some other things we did with Native Youth Movement, where we occupied the BC Treaty Commission offices in Vancouver 2 years in a row to protest these modern day treaties. And we also occupied the West Bank First Nation, which is an Okanagan Nation reserve territory. Uh, and that was against, we were invited in by members of the community who were opposed to the West Bank First Nations involvement in the treaty process. Um, yeah, there's probably been some other things, but it's been quite a few years. I can't remember them all, maybe, but that's kind of an overview of my involvement, I guess.
Quite a storied life, and it, just your personal experiences kind of suggest that, like, I think a lot of people sort of try to periodize this kind of era of red power as like the height of indigenous activism, especially with confrontations with the state and state repression. But what you've just detailed shows this extends well into the 21st century, and even locally here, we've had land defense struggles in the north against the Line 3 pipeline, land defense struggles out west where I'm from against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And also I want to just give a shout out to you. You have a really beautiful sticker graphic from the Wet'suwet'en struggle that says reconciliation is dead, and it's a really famous kind of graphic. And I remember at that time period when that sort of hashtag and phrase was being said, it was like right before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, or 2020 uh, COVID pandemic. But there was a lot happening, and I think people forget that like Canada was on the verge of a major kind of like uprising across the territories. There was rails being blockaded, things of that nature. So yeah, it's a really storied kind of history, and a lot of respect and gratitude for your art and contributions over the years and being there on the ground. Like a lot of artists and writers typically aren't frontliners, and your work through Warrior Publications, I've been reading it over the years, is very much written for and by frontline people, and so just respect for you in that regard. um I want to turn now to this piece that you've written recently. It's titled A Statement on Leonard Peltier's Clemency and the Case of Anna Mae Aquash." Um, I don't have Facebook, but I'm told by others who do have Facebook and who follow you on Facebook that you've been, quite a prolific, follower of this particular accusation and, theory that Leonard Peltier had something to do with Anna Mae Aquash's murder. We've done an entire podcast episode kind of debunking these claims, but yet it persists to this day. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your own experience with this particular case. For me personally, I was living in Rapid City off and on during these trials, and frankly I didn't know much. I was pretty young at the time. I wasn't very politically developed, but I do remember that one elder at the time wrote in a local Native publication. Her name is Dakota, or she's a Dakota scholar. She's no longer with us. Her name is Elizabeth Cook Lynn, but she said these are not murder trials; these are AIM trials. Like AIM is on trial in these particular cases, and that has always stuck with me, because when we read the trials of these alleged killers, it was really less about bringing to justice the people who killed Anna Mae Aquash, and more about trying to destroy the legacy of the American Indian movement and any indigenous resistance movement that dared to take up the cause of liberation against the colonial state. So yeah, if you can, there's a big question and a statement in there, but if you can maybe reflect on your own kind of personal knowledge and following this particular case.
Sure. Just before I start, there's one action we participated in Native Youth Movement where we traveled to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and at the time there was a number of murders that had occurred in White Clay, Nebraska, which is just across the border, the state border from Pine Ridge, and there was a big rally to march into White Clay to protest these deaths, which some people had attributed to the local sheriff, the local police force as well, being somehow involved or certainly being negligent in investigating these murders. And it was like a big like American Indian movement type of action. I think there was hundreds of people, hundreds of Lakota. Um, we walked into White Clay. Um, and they sung the American Indian Movement song like over and over, like on a loop the entire time. We marched into White Clay, and White Clay was basically deserted. It's a very small little town, but it was basically deserted. All the stores were closed because they knew that this protest march was coming into their town. And White Clay was also they were a huge supplier of alcohol to the res, which I guess it's a dry res. It has no bars or liquor stores on it. Anyway, we marched into town, and somebody from the Lakota called out that the border for the White Clay town should be moved back to the other side of the town because it was actually supposed to be part of the Pine Ridge Reservation. And there was a sign that said "Welcome to White Clay." And then a couple of the Native Youth Movement members went over to that sign and they started pushing on it, and they eventually knocked the sign down. And then a bunch of them with the Lakotas, they carried the sign to the other side of town and dropped it there. And then there was a small riot, and some of the stores were looted. Um, then the police came in, the BIA police, the riot police came in, and kind of, dispersed the protesters and whatnot. But it was kind of funny because the only person arrested was a youth, and his name was Freedom. And so we rallied at the BIA jail, and he was, shortly after he was let go. Um, but it was a really powerful experience, and it was really uh, kind of eye opening to see the conditions on the Pine Ridge Reservation. As it's one of the poorest reservations in the United States, and that's a direct result of colonialism and kind of the retribution the United States visited on the Lakota because of their resistance. And they've always had this really strong culture of resistance and a strong history of resistance up through the 1970s, of course, with the Wounded Knee, the siege of Wounded Knee. Um, so in the throughout the 1990s, when I was becoming involved in Indigenous resistance, the case of Leonard Peltier was always at the forefront. Um, so we organized a lot of us rallies and public speakers, events, stuff like this, um, around the case of Leonard Peltier. And we also organized events around the death of Anne Mae Aquash. And we had a video, it was produced, I believe, in the 1980s. It was called Bravehearted Woman, the story of Anne Mae Aquash. And of course, through the decades since 1976, when her body was found, it was always believed that the FBI had been responsible for her death, either directly or indirectly. And it had been kind of assumed that members of the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, the paramilitary force established by the tribal president, the corrupt president, Dick Wilson, had been responsible for her death. Um, and so we had these events throughout the 1990s, and then towards the end of that decade and into the early 2000s, then we started hearing reports that there had been grand juries carried out in regards to the death of Annie Mae Aquash. And one of the main suspects, John Graham, who's a Tushone from the Yukon, he was living in Vancouver, and he was eventually arrested in Vancouver, and there began an extradition process. The United States government began an extradition process to bring him back to South Dakota to face the charges. So we began a defense campaign for John Graham. Um, because we supported his claim that he would not receive a fair trial in South Dakota because the state is so racist. So we carried out a defense campaign. We challenged the theory or the story that had been presented by the police and the FBI that it was American Indian movement who were responsible for her death. Um, but we primarily focused on the extradition because it was very similar to the extradition of Leonard Peltier, who'd been arrested in Canada after he fled the United States after the Oglala shootout in 1975. And he, of course, had been extradited on based primarily on an affidavit supplied by Myrtle Poorbear, who later, uh, stated she'd been coerced into this signing this affidavit um, that implicated Leonard Peltier in the death of the two FBI agents. So we had all this that we were, taking into account and working with. So the case of John Graham's extradition uh, revealed the divisions that had occurred within the American Indian movement, um, not just in regards to the case of Annie Mae, but there was like personal differences between some of the leaders, and they had developed into these different factions and whatnot. So during the extradition case, of course, uh, John Trudell was one of the witnesses that identified John Graham and played a role in his extradition. Of course, we had controversy about Ward Churchill and Russell Means because they had publicly demanded that the FBI arrest uh, the killers of Annie Mae Aquash. And so it was this big controversial kind of case. Um, and then John Graham was extradited to South Dakota, and he was had a trial and was found guilty of murder of Annie Mae Aquash. And a lot of this was based on the confession that Arlo Looking Cloud had supplied to police in Colorado during his interrogations, where he was obviously drunk, intoxicated to some degree when he was being questioned. Um, and of course, later on, he gave more testimony against John Graham and was released, had his sentence reduced, and was released in, I believe, 2020. So now John Graham remains in jail in South Dakota. Um, and so that's kind of my involvement in the case. Uh, yeah, I can talk about the statement as well now.
Yeah. If we can cover the statement, because I think it's important, because I'll just say this just to kind of add a little bit of context around this, and viewers and listeners might already know if they followed our reporting on this issue, but the it's important to also say that, like, there's been a lot of things that have come out, especially now that there's been the commuted sentence of Leonard Peltier through executive clemency. He's commuted to home confinement, which takes effect on February 18th. It was like literally one of the last statements that President Biden had made before he left office. And he actually he signed the executive clemency, I believe, on January 19th. So like at least a day or two before it was actually announced. And in this particular case, it's not just now that Leonard Peltier has been granted clemency that this issue of whether he had something to do with Anna Mae Aquash's murder came up. It actually came up in the trials themselves. It was actually something that was brought up and promoted by a Native journalist named Paul Demain, who was later sued in a libel lawsuit by Leonard Peltier, which Leonard Peltier won. And Paul Demain was required by the court to actually retract his statements to say that Leonard Peltier didn't have anything to do with the murder of Anna Mae Aquash, although he still kind of promotes this theory, as we've seen in this recent Hulu documentary series that has come out that's been produced by Disney. So there's that, and then also at Leonard Peltier's parole hearings, the one in the 2010s and the most recent one last summer. This is also brought up by the so-called like friends of the FBI, like the Attorney General of South Dakota. Uh, um, Marty Jackley continues to write letters citing or accusing Leonard Peltier of having something to do with the murder of Anna Mae Aquash. And so this isn't something that's like, it's been ongoing for, several decades. In my kind of estimation, it actually obscures what actually happened to Anna Mae Aquash and muddies the waters. It doesn't clarify anything. And if people want to see our sort of documentary history of the FBI's knowledge of Anna Mae Aquash's murder in December of 1975, and how it's effectively covered up the people it claims to have known who killed her for 30 years, and the reasons why it didn't go forward with any indictments until the 90s. You can check out, I'll have Sina post it in the show notes here. You can check out that documentary here. But yeah, going back to the statement, maybe you can talk a little bit about, like, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm assuming, like everyone, you've participated in rallies demanding justice for Anna Mae Aquash and Leonard Peltier. And we have stated, on this show and elsewhere that we also want answers around the murder of Anna Mae Aquash, and we're not being provided those answers. So maybe you can start about like why you wrote this particular statement, and also what you have written and said publicly in the past before writing the statement.
Sure. So I wrote the statement in response to a lot of the allegations that Leonard Peltier had somehow been involved in her death, which were coming out on as after he'd been granted this clemency. And I just felt like there needed to be some kind of response to this because it was just gaining traction. And I think people who didn't even really investigate the matter were kind of jumping on the bandwagon and saying, "Oh, well, Peltier, he might have gotten clemency, but he's going to have to live with what he did," and all these types of statements, which I just thought were kind of ludicrous because his case, his imprisonment has nothing to do with the case of Annie Mae Aquash. And Denise Maloney, who is one of the daughters of Annie Mae Aquash, she's been very vocal over the years, making statements against Leonard Peltier. uh, she she successfully lobbied the Assembly of First Nations uh, to drop their resolution in support of Leonard Peltier. And so I just felt there needed to be a response to counter these allegations, which I think are really they don't really have any basis. And looking at the conspiracy theories about how Leonard Peltier was involved in this, I don't think they really hold up to any scrutiny. I mean, originally we had the conspiracy theory that he had ordered her execution because he had been bragging about killing the two FBI agents in front of her, and then became concerned that she was an informant, and so he wanted her, to be executed. And so that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny when we look at the chronology, because he had there was the rumors about whether or not Annie Mae was an informant, and we traced those back to Doug Durham, who actually was an informant for the police and the FBI, who Annie Mae Aquash was suspicious of and had confronted about being an infiltrator. Um, and that way, Durham, in response, had begun to circulate rumors that it was actually Annie Mae Aquash who was the informant. And so that's where the bad jacketing tactic began, was actually with the police infiltrator, Doug Durham. And this gained traction over time. And one of the tactics that the FBI used was arresting Annie Mae Aquash and then releasing her shortly thereafter, which is something you might see the police do with an informant or an infiltrator, because they want them back into the movement to gain more, to continue gathering intelligence. Um, so the What you're looking at the chronology, then Peltier, and this is another thing. So there's a big controversy. Well, Peltier interrogated Annie Mae Aquash, and therefore he was bad jacketing her. But if you look at the situation, Leonard Peltier was actually asked to help with the security for the American Indian movement. And so when you have somebody in your movement that a lot of people are beginning to accuse of being an informant, it's your responsibility to investigate that situation. And the two most vocal people that we've seen accusing Annie Mae Aquash of being an informant were Thelda Clark and Kamuk Banks, who later turned out to actually be an informant for the police. Um, and so Leonard Peltier admits that he did interview or question Annie Mae Aquash, and that he didn't believe the accusation that she was an informant. And this questioning, of course, became sensationalized with accounts that he had put a gun in her mouth, or he had put a gun to her head to make it seem even more threatening. And of course, Peltier denies that he did this. He questioned her, as it would have been his responsibility to, because the context of the situation is you had dozens of people being killed on the Pine Ridge Reservation by the goon squads and the police and the FBI. And so they're experiencing a deadly counterinsurgency campaign. And this question of informants every resistance movement in the world is very concerned about informants and infiltrators because of the damage that they can cause to the movement. So the idea that his questioning of Anne Mae Aquash somehow implicates him in her death, I think, is is illogical. Um, and it's just that was part of his responsibility if he's going to help with security of the movement. And of course, that's why he was in South Dakota, and that's why he was in Oglala on the day of the shootout, because he's helping protect the people. That's why he went to South Dakota. Um, and if we look at the chronology again, so he's questioned Anna Mae Aquash about being an informant. And then after the Oglala shootout, he's a fugitive. He's one of the most wanted by the FBI. There's a nationwide manhunt underway for him. And as he's a fugitive, he's traveling with Dennis Banks, his wife, Dennis's wife, Kamuk Banks, and Annie Mae Aquash in a motorhome. And they were stopped in Oregon in, I think, November 16th, 1975. And Peltier was able to escape along with Dennis Banks, and Annie Mae Aquash and Kamuk Banks were arrested. And that's when the FBI, she's charged with possession of firearms and explosives. And that's another example where the FBI released her in Rapid City, I believe. But
Here, here, South Dakota.
If Peltier had believed she was an informant or like, why would he be traveling with her when he's one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States? Like, why would he be with her? So there's just those types of things, like uh, I think should show people that these allegations are without any basis. And the smear campaign against the American Indian movement, which the Maloney family has engaged in for a couple of decades now, because I think they really do hate the American Indian movement, because they blame AIM for her death. And I think they're basically, they're pro police. Uh, Deborah Maloney, the other daughter, of course, was an RCMP officer, and Jim Maloney is a martial arts instructor, and he's carried out a lot of training for police and prison guards and security guards and whatnot over the decades as well. So they're no friends or allies of Indigenous resistance, and I think that's part of the basis for their continued smear campaign against the American Indian movement. And the American Indian movement, was divided. It had different factions. Um, but to say this thing that the AIM leadership ordered the death of Annie Mae Aquash, when it was the AIM members in South Dakota who helped have Annie Mae Aquash's body interned, and it was the AIM who acquired an independent coroner to conduct a second autopsy, which found that she'd actually been shot in the back of the head, which the first coroner, who worked regularly, with the FBI and the police, he had not discovered that, and he had, listed her death as being from exposure. And so, I mean, that shows the American Indian movement wanted to know who was responsible for Annie Mae's Aquash, for Annie Mae Aquash's death. Um, and that was the position of most of the American Indian movement for decades, was that, the FBI was ultimately responsible for her death. And I think that's the position that uh, people should have, is that it was ultimately the FBI who were responsible for Annie Mae Aquash's death, because they used the tactic of bad jacketing her and spreading the rumor and misinformation that she was an informant. And this was a tactic they used against other movements. And if you look at the Black Panther Party, who were a big target of the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, there were numerous people who were actually uh, killed because of this tactic used by the FBI, who were bad jacketed and who were framed as being informants when in reality they weren't. So I think there's a lot of lessons people can learn from this entire period of counterinsurgency that the FBI engaged in. And this is I think, a very important case to examine and to draw lessons from.
Yeah. I really appreciate your sort of detailing the case, and just to kind of add a little bit of context to some of this stuff. when Anna Mae Aquash's body was found by the rancher. I can't remember his first name. I think his last name was Amiot. There were several agencies of the police. There was the BIA police and the FBI who showed up to what was just an exposure death, which was ruled as an exposure death. And it makes you wonder, what were they doing? Why was there such a heavy police presence? But also, some of the people who were on scene, some of the officers who were on scene actually knew who Anna Mae Aquash was and had interrogated her in the past. And she had, like kind of signature jewelry that she always wore. That was a dead giveaway. And even in the FBI, when they interrogated her in Pierce, South Dakota, I think they picked her up in at Leonard Peltier's property when she was camping there for Sundance, I believe. She was taken into FBI custody, and when they do that, they take everything that you possess. They take photos of your tattoos, they take photos of your face, they know any kind of marks that you have, any kind of distinguishing features. And one of the distinguishing features that she had was this piece of jewelry that she always wore, and it's actually listed in when Agent Price found her and took her into custody. It's listed in one of the things that he took from her. And then it was also listed on her body when she was found, supposedly due to exposure. And Agent Price knew that. So his interview recently in the Hulu documentary is a complete fabrication and a rewriting of the facts. I mean, just based on the things that he confessed to knowing in his own reports about who she was and what she was wearing. The other sort of details that you kind of lay out of the case as well, like there was no physical evidence tying her accused and then convicted killers to the actual murder. It's not to exonerate them. I'm not like trying to do that in this moment, but it's to say that the eyewitness testimony was enough for a jury to convict them. And the testimony came, and we've detailed one FBI informant who was Kamuk Nichols, who was Dennis Banks's former partner. But there's another FBI informant that was involved in that particular case, who we're going to do a special episode on. But if people actually knew that it was his testimony, he was a man who was pretending to be a native person. He claimed to be Northern Cheyenne. He told members of the American Indian movement that he was writing a book on the American Indian movement and was interviewing him. He even interviewed John Graham in the Yukon, and he interviewed others, trying to get them to confess. And then it turned out that he was being paid by the FBI to inform. So this is in the 90s and the 2000s. So a lot of times people think, well, there was a lot of FBI activity in the 70s, for sure, right? Like there was definitely infiltration. We definitely have these kind of more famous cases, as you pointed out, with Doug Durham. It's kind of being outed as a paid, not just an FBI informant, but according to his own words, an FBI operative who had infiltrated the movement and caused a lot of chaos and destruction. And in fact, like fingered Anna Mae Aquash as an FBI informant. When he himself was, and so there's that kind of aspect of it, that this infiltration of the movement was still happening. So if the movement died, as a lot of these people say, then why were they still actively sending in FBI informants and still infiltrating and still, still sort of causing disruption? And I would say in many ways, these trials and the narrative persist solely based on rumor, as you pointed out. These are rumors, and the source of these rumors are coming from FBI informants, right? And the only person on this planet who actually knows what happened between him and Anna Mae Aquash is Leonard Peltier himself, and he denies ever putting a gun to her head, right? And so we can sit and debate at the end of the day, but also he was never convicted. This is not something that he was ever convicted for, nor was he, ever brought to trial. So like this accusation against him still persists, but it's a way to use very legitimate cases of murder, missing Indigenous women, and weaponize it against the movement itself. And it also ignores that the movement is being portrayed in a way that it was just dominated by dudes who were calling all the shots. If that was the case, the movement would have collapsed because by 1975, the male leadership was all tied up in court cases, they were serving time. That's why Women of All Red Nations formed, was to take up the mantle of the movement and to continue doing the task. It also ignores the contributions of Native women in this. And in the Hulu documentary, it does this thing where it frames actual Oglala women as the people who killed Anna Mae Aquash, which is totally not the case. If you ask, she was a very well respected person. She was considered part of that community. And as you point out, if she was so afraid for her life, and if Leonard Peltier and Dennis Banks and all these people were trying to kill her, why would she um, skip her own court hearing, become a federal fugitive herself, you know, to go try to pursue these other federal fugitives who are being pursued by the FBI? It doesn't make logical sense. If she was so afraid for her life, it's because they were her comrades. They were her, people she entrusted with her own safety. I'm not trying to exonerate any of these individuals, because I do think that there are answers that only they can, they can provide. And I do think there are people who are still alive who can come forward and actually tell us what had happened. So I think we have a question from our viewers. This is a good one for you, Gord. It says, how do you see these tactics being used in and against Indigenous-led movements today? This is by Mateo Crescia.
I mean, the tactics of the FBI are pretty standard counterinsurgency tactics that you'll see around the world anytime there's resistance movements that emerge. And in Canada, the RCMP, uh, which are basically our version of the FBI, except that they're a uniformed police force, they're a federal police force. I mean, they use these same tactics all the time: infiltration, surveillance, widespread surveillance. Um, so, I mean, we haven't, because like right now, the resistance movement, the activity level isn't really super high right now, right? Um, so we're not seeing these high profile infiltrators and whatnot, but we have experienced them in our movements. Certainly during the anti-Olympic campaign we did in 20 leading up to the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. In our organizing group in Vancouver, which had Indigenous and non-Indigenous people involved, we had I think at least 5 or 6 people that we would identify as being police infiltrators, um, and they used their various tactics. What they did in that instance was all the infiltrators were people of color, and they were trying to exploit the uh, the anti-racist nature of our social movements. Um, and they, there was one meeting we had where there was 2 people showed up. They're both people of color, and one was kind of like the bad cop. He was like really obviously an infiltrator. He was asking all the questions you would suspect of an infiltrator, like how many people do we expect to be at this rally, or what are we going to do at this, and what are we going to do if this happens. And so he was very quickly identified as being an infiltrator and was pushed out of our group. And the other guy was very, very, very low key, never spoke up, never asked odd questions. And of course, he turned out to be a long term infiltrator. And this infiltration extended into the G20, organizing against the G20 summit, which also occurred in 2010 in Toronto, where they had a number of infiltrators, police infiltrators. And I actually met one of them at a house that was used by activists. Activists lived in. She had actually wormed her way into the house as a roommate, and she was very pleasant when I met her. And the result of those infiltrators was that a number of organizers against the G20 summit were eventually charged with conspiracy and mischief, and served. Some of them served over a year in prison, I believe, and so that's kind of indicative of the danger that these infiltrators can pose to movements, and why there's such why there's such a threat to people organizing. I think the most common uh, counterinsurgency tactic that we encounter, and which is consistent regardless of the level of activity of the movement, is surveillance. And primarily nowadays, I would say technical surveillance. So all your internet activity is going to be monitored if you're on some kind of a list of people that the state wants to maintain surveillance over. Um, it's these types of operations with infiltrators. Uh, these are big operations for the police because they require a lot of resources. It's not just like one person walking into a meeting and that's it, because they have to have a whole team around them organizing these contacts with the movement, providing some kind of security for their infiltrators as well. And so these are pretty big operations. One thing I'd mention in Canada, we have the RCMP has a long history of using uh, the same types of tactics as the FBI. We also have another thing that they do here. It's called Mr. Big. It's when they have a suspect. It's almost always a murder case when they have a suspect, and they'll actually set up this entire scenario where they pose as heavy duty criminals like mobsters, members of the mafia, or some kind of organized crime group, and they'll set up a whole scenario to which can last months and cost millions of dollars, involve dozens and dozens of police officers to eventually get this suspect to admit that they were involved in a murder. Um, so uh, it's it's hard to maybe wrap. It's hard for people to maybe wrap their heads around the the resources that the state has available to uh, conduct these types of operations against movements. But I would really recommend that people grab the book by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall. It's called Agents of Repression: The FBI's Secret War Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, because that's a very well documented book about a lot of the tactics that the FBI used in the 1960s and the 1970s as part of their campaign to destroy these movements. And one thing I would mention as well, these the smear campaign against the American Indian movement, um, these this the discussion about the patriarchal aspects of the movement. I mean, these aren't without basis, and all the movements of that time period, and even today, were affected by this kind of the patriarchal nature of the society we live in. But also, all the movements at the time, I would say, were quite dysfunctional, and this made them vulnerable to the counterinsurgency tactics of the police and the FBI. Um, so, if you look at some of the analysis of the Black Panther Party, for example, was that they excused a lot of a kind of macho, ultra militant behavior, because that was what they were promoting, was this very militant movement. And so you had infiltrators who came in who had very poor politics, or no politics at all, but offered their services and their experiences in using firearms, or conducting raids and these types of missions. um, and so it's something that our movements should also reflect on, is the dysfunction of our movements, which is the result of colonialism. And if you look at AIM from the period, the 60s and the 70s, I mean, these are the products of the residential schools, the prisons, the urbanization, the acculturation that generations of Indigenous people experienced. And it's actually more to it's to their credit that they were able to overcome this colonization and engage in this resistance movement to the degree that they did. And in fa- and in the in phase of the counterinsurgency that they faced, this deadly counterinsurgency campaign. And I think it's to their credit that they carried on and were quite successful in a lot of their endeavors. And they actually were like a revolutionary movement, and they transformed the indigenous consciousness throughout North America. And that's what I think this smear campaign against AIM is trying to overturn in many ways, and to smear indigenous resistance by extension. And I think that's another reason why I came out with this statement. And I think it's important to counter this narrative that's coming from people who are opposed to indigenous resistance, who are colonized to such an extent that they support the state, the colonial state, and its repressive actions.
Yeah, thanks so much for that kind of extensive answer, and I think you covered a lot of ground. I just want to maybe push back a little bit on even just like the extent to which we have documentation of this infiltration and surveillance of the American Indian movement and disruption, as you pointed out, has been largely written by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall in Agents of Repression. And I want to read this quote from Ward Churchill himself about that particular book, which we can. I kind of have a discuss. I was going to do this in a different episode, but you brought it up, so it's like we should talk about it. You mentioned it earlier, and so he's talking about this statement that was made in front of a Denver federal courthouse back in September 16th, 1999, when Anna Mae Aquash's cousin Robert Pictou-Branscombe had a press conference. Or excuse me, that was in Ottawa, but it was around the same time that I believe it was, as you mentioned, he had a press conference in Denver, and he was joined by Russell Means and I think it was Glenn Morris and Ward Churchill himself, where they actually called for the arrests and prosecution of these alleged, of these named killers. And he goes on to say, he goes on to in this particular piece, and he wrote it in 2003, and he's reflecting on agents of repression. He goes on to essentially finger the Belcourt brothers, Vernon Belcourt and Clyde Belcourt, as possibly ordering the murder of Anna Mae Aquash, the assassination. So he himself is implicated in this kind of this finger pointing game that's happening within and among leadership, and himself, I would say, was considered by many a bad actor for his kind of mudslinging himself. And unfortunately, Agents of Repression is that kind of only volume that we have on that particular moment in time, and the FBI's tactics. It also goes without saying that Ward Churchill's claims to who he is have been challenged by Indigenous people themselves. So that's a whole nother separate issue. But I just wanted to kind of put that caveat in there that even people who are writing these histories also are participating in this kind of snitch jacketing, because he's implying that Vernon Belcourt was an FBI informant, which is a pretty big accusation.
I think one thing that comes out of this whole case is like you see the leadership of the American Indian movement like really fractured. I mean, these divisions go back to the mid 70s, but when it comes to this case, you see a real fracturing of the movement, and um, the abandonment of principles of that a resistance movement needs to stand on if it's going to carry out resistance. And one of those principles is non-collaboration with the state and not turning over members of your movement to the state. And so I think that you see that with that press conference you're referring to with Russell Means and Ward Churchill calling for the arrest of the alleged killers and pointing the finger at the Bellacourts. Um, I think that's another lesson we should learn is like that type of activity, it really only serves the interest of the state. It doesn't help your resistance movement. Um, and there is a lot of there is some areas of this case where you do have to look at the at some factions of the movement though, and wonder like if if there's basis to this, that this faction uh, came to the conclusion that Annie Mae was a threat to the movement somehow. And if we're going to be completely objective about things, that's something that should be considered as well. Obviously, some people um, at some point decided that she needed to be executed, and we're not privy to the information that they had or the discussions that were undertaken. um, this is something that happens in resistance movements. I mean, if you look at the Palestinian resistance movement, uh, they have a big problem with infiltrators and informants because the Israeli intelligence is constantly recruiting informants from within the Palestinian population. And even within this last year of the genocide in Gaza, the resistance is still dealing with informants who are contributing to the deaths of Palestinians and Palestinian resistance fighters. And every most movements who deal with this situation, that's if they find informants and infiltrators, uh, execution is often uh, the punishment for these individuals who engage in these types of activities, collaborating with the enemy. And even most governments have some kind of charges for treason, and so it's not just unique to American Indian movement, that it's going to have to figure out how that it had to deal with what it's suspected to be an informant. It's common for movements to have to deal with these types of things, but again, I think in the case of Annie Mae Aquash, like, we have to follow the source of these rumors, and that goes back to the FBI. And that's another thing about the Maloney family. They say they want to have justice. Well, they had two members of the American Indian movement charged and convicted and imprisoned. One is now out, but they were imprisoned. If we believe the story about the Bellecourts being involved, well, they're both passed away now. Clyde and Vern Bellecourt have passed away. Um, Peltier has nothing to do with the death of Annie Mae Aquash. If they're serious about pursuing this, I don't understand why they're not pursuing the FBI uh, and the bad jacketing tactic that they used against Annie Mae Aquash. If they really want justice, why aren't they going after the FBI?
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I'll follow up with this quote. I found it in Ward Churchill's, because this is him taking a police narrative about what you just said about the Belcourt brothers, which I think is highly problematic. And I've actually gone back and looked at the origins of this narrative and talked to people who were around at the time. But he says in this connections, this individual's naming of Vernon Belcourt as having ordered the Aquash murder may be the decisive ingredient. An internal investigation undertaken by the Confederation of Autonomous AIM chapters during the early 1990s concluded, for a variety of reasons, that Belcourt had, in all probability, functioned as an agent provocateur since the day he had joined the movement in 1970. It was thoroughly documented that he had been, this is Vernon Belcourt, he had been at the heart of virtually every significant factional dispute that had disrupted AIM since at least the early as 1973, routinely sowing rumors that other AIM members were police infiltrators and otherwise conducting himself in a manner guaranteed to foment discord and distrust. Instructively, he and his younger brother Clyde Belcourt were also the only AIM notables never convicted of any offense during the period of maximal FBI repression. But then he also says, all that happened was that veteran Denver police detective Abe Alonzo, who was assigned to Aquash's unsolved case in 1994, was reassigned abruptly and without explanation. So he's making this argument in this particular quote that somehow Abe Alonzo, who uh, helped cover up the assassination of several Chicano activists in Denver, somehow actually telling the truth and is some benevolent figure who's trying to save Anna Mae Aquash, which I think is really messed up for somebody, not just of Ward Churchill's nature, but anybody to suggest that Abe Alonzo is acting in good faith. somebody who, was known to a lot of the activists who were actually killed at the hands of police. Um, Alonso seems to have reached, and he's basically saying, these unseen forces are reassigning Abe Alonso and trying not to, get him to the truth. And I've read Abe Alonso's account of all of these things, and it's actually, he's not sympathetic to any of these people, and in fact, he kind of glorifies the killing of Chicano activists in Denver at this time, specifically from the Crusade for Justice. And I'm bringing this up because I have a really difficult time swallowing the narrative that is being promoted specifically by police officers, both federal and local, who are promoting this narrative that the American Indian movement had killed one of its own. It's not to say that it, like, the people who carried out the assassination weren't affiliated with AIM or were AIM members, but as you said, and as the documents show, even from the FBI, they knew who did it, and they haven't disclosed how they knew, or why they haven't didn't do an investigation for 30 years, or why it went forward at one point in time when there was no physical evidence tying the people who were named. There's too many questions to be so certain, in my opinion, as where Churchill is in this case, and he's not the only one to assert these particular accusations. And in fact, I find it incredibly destructive, especially at that moment in time when there are three individuals. Actually, there are more individuals, not just the three who were named and have become, kind of public faces of the murder trials, but others who were caught within that broader accusation that he's making in this particular, and it's written. It's not like it's this is a secret thing. So I just kind of want to put that caveat in, because we are in this moment where we should be looking back at this time period. There hasn't, at the time it was happening, at the time these trials were happening, there was a lot coming out. And I will just say that, when Doug Durham was outed as an FBI informant, or an operative, as he claims, he was not executed. When, Blue Dove, all these other folks who were outed as FBI informants, there was no process of taking them out in terms of like assassinating them. So why does this
Absolutely.
deviate? Why does this deviate from the trend? And then why does it become the case? I'm not asking you to answer that question. I'm just saying it's like it becomes so productive to use this case to destroy individuals, and to smear certain people, but also to create this general atmosphere of distrust of resistance movements, as I think you kind of point out in your piece very, very poignantly.
Yeah, I would agree. It definitely it makes you wonder, like, of all the unsolved killings that occurred in Pine Ridge from 1973 to 1975, 76. Yeah, why did they choose the Annie Mae Aquash case? That's the one we're gonna solve, you know. And then it became this big campaign. It certainly does appear like the objective isn't just to find the people responsible for her death, but to actually undermine the legacy that the American Indian movement created, and the, the the indigenous resistance overall. Yeah, I certainly have to agree with that. And it certainly it there was no policy from AIM of how to deal with infiltrators or informants, and the Anne Mae Aquash case would certainly be the most exceptional case, because that wasn't how the movement overall dealt with informants and infiltrators. Um, but that's like I mean, that's why there are unanswered questions about the case, about the involvement of the FBI and police in her death. Um, and that, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. I think we have one question, and maybe we can get some closing thoughts. But this is also coming from Mateo Crescia. Thank you. How can we protect our movements from this attempt at neutralizing slash destruction without self-destruction or self-neutralizing? That's a really good question. Like, because I think I'll try to answer it, but I'll turn it over to you. But I think just this, like, I think it's important to point out, like, the context, as you were saying, the historical context. People were literally dying. When Myrtle Pourbear was made that false affidavit, she was being shown photographs of Anna Mae Aquash's dead body. And the FBI, according to her court testimony during the trial, was saying this could happen to you if you don't cooperate. We're going to take your children away. Um, Zagras, or what was his name? I forgot his name. Zagrassi he was also featured in the Hulu documentary. He also called the FBI, America's colonial police force. And he's like, essentially, the Oglala Lakota Nation was subdued by a far superior colonial power. And it's only natural that the FBI as a police force comes in and exerts, its jurisdiction and authority against a conquered people. Those are his words, not mine. And to do that requires them to exploit our own kinship relations, people internally within our communities. Like, I think most recently you look at the Standing Rock protests, the No Dapple movement, and you have Heath Harmon, who's a Native person, who infiltrated the movement, was an FBI informant. The FBI has admitted that it had between 1 to 10 informants on the ground at the time, on any given day, in the encampments themselves. But I think it's not an answer to this question, but it's to say that this idea that somehow the FBI is going to solve and cure, or to find a solution for murdered, missing Indigenous women or relatives is a completely false assumption, or that somehow they're acting with benevolence when it comes to Anna Mae Aquash's case, but not the dozens, if not hundreds, of other cases of relatives who have gone missing and who have been abused. So I think it's to disabuse ourselves of this notion that these colonial, according to their own definitions, colonial police forces are operating in the best interests of our own people. And I think what was attempted at in some of these instances was to create forms and mechanisms of accountability for people who were from these nations. Oftentimes these infiltrators, as we've seen before, are not, from these nations. They have to, pretend that they're from these nations. They have to, as Doug Durham did, as this other individual did that I was talking about earlier, have to literally adopt a native identity. And so I think using one form of, of protection is just our kinship. How strong are our kinship relations? Do we have conversations with each other that are frank and honest? That's, I think, the first step. I think a lot of what happened in this moment in time was running with something without actually trying to find, concrete answers, or just talking to folks. But anyways, I'll let you address that question.
I mean, I think I would refer people again to that book, Agents of Repression. It's the best documented uh, collection of information about the FBI's counterintelligence program and the strategies and tactics that were used to, seriously damage these movements. So I would recommend people, and over just generally, I would say knowledge about counterinsurgency tactics, um, security measures that movements and individuals can take to better protect themselves and the movements that they're a part of. I think these are really important aspects to protecting our movements against this type of counterinsurgency operations. Um, so knowledge is power. I think it can empower people, um, and not just learning from that period of time, because of course there's been a lot of cases, counterinsurgency tactics over the years since the 1970s. Now it's much more developed with the widespread use of technical surveillance, because we're all so wired in. We're using our phones, Facebook, social media, and all this stuff. So there's a whole new area of surveillance that people need to be more aware of if they're going to engage in a resistance movement that's going to face these types of counterinsurgency actions. Um, certainly what you were talking about, sitting down and talking to one another type of thing. I mean, a lot of these FBI tactics from the early 70s were very, very crude. They would write fake letters between different groups that had maybe that were competing with one another or had some kind of adversarial relationship. They would write threatening letters pretending to be from one group to another, and that would actually instigate assaults and, in some cases, even uh, lethal assaults. In the case of the Black Panther Party, um, so very, very crude techniques. They would produce fake comic books that were presented as being from the Black Panther Party that were super racist against white people, and distribute those in attempts to get the Black Panther Party, their survival schools type of thing, their food programs, their lunch programs for school kids, to get those to get companies to cancel their donations to the Black Panther Party. Just the most crude, simplistic things you can imagine were actually effective, and a big part of that was because these people that were being targeted didn't have lines of communication between one another, and that again, I refer back to there was dysfunctions in the movement that the police and the FBI were able to exploit. Um, so that's another aspect, that to protect our movements, we need to look at our movement and understand, some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our movements, and taking into account the social dysfunction that our people uh, have suffered and live under and live with in our communities, the dysfunction in our communities. Um, People who are alcoholics or drug addicts are vulnerable to pressure from the police. Like these types of things, if a movement wants to defend itself, these types of things have to be taken into account. There are cases of informants who were drug addicts who were basically coerced by police to carry out, uh, you know, uh, conversations with movement members while wearing uh, microphones to record their conversations. So all these types of things have to be taken into consideration. I think the most important thing is to gain knowledge about counterinsurgency tactics and security measures that movements can use to protect themselves. And a lot of this information is available on the internet. Um, yeah, so I think that's probably the first, the most important steps in movements defending themselves against state repression.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time, Gord. Again, big fan. Huge props to all your publications and everything. We've posted some of them in the show notes, so check them out. I just want to do one last kind of pitch. We have this is independent funded media. We don't get big donations from anybody. We're all membership funded. So if folks can, if they have a dollar or two, please check out the GoFundMe that we have going right now. We pay our content editors to do these kinds of things for us, these videos. We also have a Patreon. You can join for $2 a month. But if you just want to make a one-time $1 donation, $10 donation, whatever, please go to the GoFundMe link in the show notes or in the chat, and just make a small contribution if you can. If not, then just share this content with your friends, with your family. We do always appreciate, we make all of our content open and accessible on YouTube. We're trying to do more live streams as well. So we want to have more guests on, like Gord, to talk about these important issues that affect our movements and affect our communities. So Gord, what's the best way for people to follow your work? We have that Warrior Publications website, but is there any way, or is there anything that you want folks to be on the lookout for, or to follow, or to anything you want to lift up in this moment?
Not really. Yeah, the Warrior Publications. It's the main way I put out statements. It's mostly an archive. It's like a news aggregator of news about Indigenous peoples and resistance. Um, I am waiting for a script on a graphic novel about residential schools. So I expect to be working on that this year, and perhaps towards the end of this year or 2026, it'll be published. I think it's going to be about a 100-page black and white graphic novel about the history of residential schools. I'm working with somebody else who's actually writing the script and whatnot. Um, but otherwise, yeah, just we're living in really volatile times right now. There's a lot of change. We've got the rise of the far right fascist movements. We have the climate crisis. We have an economic crisis. We have wars in Ukraine, Palestine. Uh, so I think people should, be aware of what's going on in the world because it's going to affect them. And I think I always promote the idea of survival and resistance. So resistance movements are important because they can defend our territory and the natural world that we rely on for our actual life and survival. Um, and they help build our movements while defending our territories. And I think this is important because of there's a growing potential that the system is going to experience some serious crises, economic crises, climate crises, um, social conflict, and the rise of these far right fascist movements and these far right uh, governments that are taking power increasingly around the world. So, if I were to leave with that, I would just say, prepare for uh, greater social conflict in the years to come. And this ties back into what we're talking about, the lessons that we can learn from the case of Anne Mae Aquash and the lessons we can learn from the state's counterinsurgency campaign that they conducted against the American Indian movement.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ward. One final announcement: February 14th, we're doing a Red Valentine special live stream. So check it out. There'll be more information about it. Check out Gord's work. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks for sharing your words. Thanks for, we want to invite you on once that new graphic novel comes out because it's an issue that's affecting all of our communities right now. And I think you provide an accessible way to kind of tackle these big questions, that kind of transcend sort of inaccessible spaces like the academy, but it's for people to read, and it's for very few people write things that you can read on the front line, or you can read in a classroom, you can read in a study group, and I would say your work has very much transcended that and is very well respected by a lot of community people and frontliners. So it's an honor to have you on the show. Somebody who's been following your work since I was a wee one. So thanks so much, Gord.
Well, thanks for having me, and carry on with your work. I think it's really important, all these forms of communication discussing these types of issues.